Thank you for the introduction. As I said, my name is Chris, and I'm a senior tech artist from Epic Games. In case my accent hasn't given me away at this point, I am from Australia, so I'm going to give you a pre-apology, just in case I drop back to any Australian slang or fall asleep from jet lag. So we'll see how we go. Now, quick heads up, there's only a couple of people up here in the splash zone, but I will have a bunch of graphs and config variables popping up during this. So if you're keen on seeing some of those things, you may want to come forward. But if you want to be there in the shelter back there, I understand too. So this is world building tips and tricks. And there we go. It's essentially going to be a highlight reel of world building tricks that developers often don't know about. Now, these are the things that have just generally made me wince when I've noticed people not using them. And this basically boils down to being cool stuff that might make your life easier. So I'm going to kind of go through a rapid-fire thing. We're going to cover a lot of different things reasonably quickly, because I've only got 30 minutes to do it. So let's begin with a discussion of scene construction. The first thing that I want to touch on here is actually the environment light mixer. If you go to Window, Environment Light Mixer, it's a little tricky to see with the glare, but essentially Unreal actually gives you a bunch of buttons that people don't know about, that if you just keep left-clicking, it will give you your fog, clouds, skylight, directional lights, and like just all of your default lighting setup straight out of the box. It's frustrating because people kind of drop these in manually, but there is literally just a little window that is like, set this up for me and give me all of the relevant controls. Cube grid is another thing that I don't really see people using, but you really should consider it if you're getting into UE or you're doing any level design. This is me at 2 times speed. But the ability to just kind of carve out space very quickly. Again, I see a lot of world designers still doing a lot of their initial blockouts in Max, Maya, Blender, that kind of thing. And I strongly recommend you consider using CubeGrid for some of the quick prototyping, because it is very, very quick to get your spaces together. And when you click Apply, it'll immediately work with our global illumination and everything else. Within Unreal, there's a great feature that we've had for quite a long time called splines, and you can spline mesh, so you can bend meshes as you need to. A little while ago, we actually added this thing, which is the spline tool. It's hidden away inside the modeling mode, so people don't know about it. But essentially, it lets you get any single blueprint you've got that may be used for like creating pipes or whatever, and it overrides the spline component and allows you to draw that spline component in. I bring this up because if you have any spline tools in Unreal at all, it actually gives you the ability to paint them in straight out of the box. Landmass erosion is something that's snuck in with 5.4. This is really, really cool, because you get your base landscape, drop this in with the landmass plugin, and it'll actually run a particle sim on your environment, and you can tell it which layers to paint into. And if you give it just a second of processing, it'll get my clearly ugly map and immediately give you all of that, that degradation and like that erosion carved straight in. I bring it up because of how many people, again, I see dropping back to tools like World Machine to kind of get that look. And I'm like, it was one plugin that is built into the engine away that you should really be leveraging. The other one that this is going to be really tough to see in the lighting here, but this is something I'll be touching on in tomorrow's workshop when we're covering technical art. But you know when your meshes touch the ground and you get that really hard, ugly seam? You don't need to. It's worth noting that we have a feature built into UE called Runtime Virtual Textures, which allow meshes to actually sample the environment beneath them. I bring this up because a lot of folks, especially those that are migrating from Unity, when they come over to UE, they don't know about runtime virtual textures, which clearly sounds like it was named by an engineer, right? And it essentially allows you to like sample the ground and blend smoothly between your grass and your dirt into your rocks and things like that. It's a really useful thing, but it is tucked away. The other one I want to flag inside of on the scene construction side of things is the texture variation node. This is something that's hidden away, but again, very useful. The graphs are a little tricky to see from back there, but as you can see, it's just one node that when you drop it in, it does a separate sampling on the UVs to kind of break up any patterns that you may see from standard-based tiling, and I think it's really good. Another feature that we've actually brought back, which to me is kind of like warm and fuzzy because it's back from a UE3 feature that I used to use a lot, wasn't in Unreal Engine 4, but then it's back in 5, is property coloration view mode. This is something we reintroduced with 5.4. I wanted to bring this up with a lot of people because it's super powerful. All it is this. You activate the view mode, and then with Control-Click, you can click on any variable, and Unreal will then make every single item in the screen that has that variable and has that variable at the same value and make it bright red. So if you want to quickly be like, what has physics turned on as well? Control-Click, all right, it's all of these things. What has this material applied? Control-Click, see all of those things. You know what I mean? Really, really powerful, tucked away. A lot of people don't know about it. The color picker is something that I shouldn't want to bring up with a big audience, but I will. Just be aware that you can drag any colors to the top here, name them, and save them as themes. So if you want your red team and your blue team to be consistent colors, and you don't want your programmers just eyeballing the rough red that it was meant to be or the blue that they thought it would be, if you've picked very specific reds and blues, make sure that you use this because every color picker in the engine, for your lighting, for your particles, for your materials, all feed back into this and can access it. A feature that's definitely, ironically, not going to work due to the glare/exposure that you've got right now is local exposure. I bring this one up because, again, you ever play a game where if you're standing inside of a dark room looking out of a doorway, it's either incredibly bright in the field or incredibly dark in the room? You know what I mean? You don't get that balance. Local exposure is really useful. We brought it in with the Matrix Awakens demo a little while ago. What it essentially lets you do is double sample the exposure, and it creates a mask that grabs those two areas where they differ, and it blends them back into each other, which gives you the detail in the room as well as that detail in the field. Location volumes are another feature that people haven't really been using that I kind of wanted to touch on here. Essentially, these are really straightforward. You can just get a big old volume and say, hey, this area here is going to be referred to as, I think I called it like Coolsville. You can't see it here, but I can give that a name, and whenever I name it and hit save, it actually appears down in my mini-map as an area that says this area of the world is this named location. And it's very quick for you to then enable and disable different parts of the world if you're jumping around. A lot of people still drag and drop to kind of highlight those things. And when it comes to streaming information in and out of the world, the other thing I wanted to touch on was pinning. Because when you are using world partition, a little tricky to see here, but there is the ability to, next to any actor to actually select pin, which means that it disregards all of the streaming logic that's going on in Unreal and allows that thing to permanently stay in. For any of the folks out here that are leads, I find custom filters to be really, really powerful for folks. A little tough to read, but essentially what it allows you to do is you can type in any regular expression. So I can type in something like try count is greater than 50,000 and nanite is equal to false. And if I do that, it will actually create a custom filter on the side that allows me to now find any weirdly high poly meshes that don't have nanite, which allows me to really quickly narrow that down. But I can kind of keep that saved out as a default setting to look at any point. For any folks using the water system inside of UE, the two things I want to flag about the water system that catch people off guard. One of them is that we've tucked away all of the defaults for that inside of the project settings, which is a little unrelated to the rest of how UE generally works. It's so that we can have a consistent system without you having to create subclasses. Don't stress about that. The thing you need to know is that if you're setting up your project, be aware that you want to set up your water systems through the project settings, not through dropping every individual river in and manually coloring it in. And the other thing that I see happening with developers leveraging Unreal's built-in water system is this. You can kind of see that. So by default, you get kind of blocky shadows on the surface of water, whereas what we generally want is a smoother kind of fall off on those shadows, something that's actually taking advantage of the virtual shadow mapping. There is a console command to turn that on, and if you are using water and you can afford that little extra bit of overhead, I strongly recommend it, as it will give you a quality bump. Another big call out on top of setting up your environment for general scene construction is the landscape physical material node. So inside of any landscape physical material that you're setting up inside of Unreal, what you can effectively do once this GIF restarts is you can have this output, and any landscape that runs into that, it essentially says, hey, let's look at these layers. They're spitting out, this is dirt. These layers are all going to say, I'm concrete. So this is how we can make sure at all times when you are on your landscapes, this tiny little bit of work here that is literally 30 seconds to set up on your landscape is the difference between bullets firing into the ground and footstep sounds having the correct particle systems and and sound effects, so please do it. You'll make my life better. Reload asset is another thing that catches a lot of people off guard. Like, who here has ever restarted the editor because they messed up what they were doing, and they're like, oh, no, I don't want to save this, but I don't know how to get back to the state that it was in, so I'm going to restart the entire editor. This guy laughing over here is clearly one of them. Thank you. If you right-click on an asset, go to Asset Actions and hit Reload, it will just reload that asset back to the state that it was in when the editor was launched. You don't need to reboot the entire project. I just saved you all 2 minutes of your day. Generally, there's a couple of things I wanted to point out on the category of working with Nanite. We've recently added the concept of dynamic displacement into Nanite, which is really great. And it lets you kind of have active kind of extrusions happening. I just want to flag that when you are working with Nanite, Nanite landscapes are a thing. And more importantly, Nanite landscapes can have tessellation enabled. So every different color here is a different try. And you'll notice that the landscapes down here end up being incredibly dense, right? But the really cool part of that is it allows you to have really efficient rendering that's correctly culling. But on top of that as well, we also can have a material feeding right back into it. So every little bump and dip and everything from the height map gets pushed back into the landscape. It came in with 5.4. Strongly recommend people use it. Because it's off by default, I haven't seen as many people jump onto it as I would like. Another thing that's worth noting that's kind of interesting is Nanite allows for really high poly meshes, right? But a lot of people don't think about the consequence of that. And the consequence of that is you actually can bake data into your mesh instead of storing it as texture files, which allows you to actually remove a ton of textures in your project, because I can store all of my curvature, my ambient occlusion, my roughness, those kinds of things into the mesh directly. Maybe not roughness, but like you can store that info to allow you to do much nicer procedural materials. And again, you can rebake that in Engine if you've done little modifications without having to have just a ton of textures, which really does actually save you quite a lot of memory in the long run. If you're ever working with Nanite and your trees disappear, this is a really common issue. It's because we get rid of polygons that are smaller than 1 pixel. There's a checkbox. It's literally just a checkbox to get it working. But if you open up your tree, click Preserve Area, Nanite meshes that are dense foliage won't disappear at a distance, and really, really handy to know will make your life easier. Nanite overdraw is one of the definite things that you need to worry about. So this is kind of like one of the performance optimization things that we've had in recent days. I bring this up because essentially what happens is if you have like really, really densely packed meshes that are on top of one another, like really carefully layered, that's one of the things you need to watch out with Nanite. We can get away with like a billion poly mesh, but if we have like 100 rock meshes that are all basically on top of each other fighting for the top thing, that's when that the performance we have to look after. So the Nanite Overdraw View mode can be enabled just from the top menu to actually check on that. But the other thing with that is that if you think about it, virtual shadow maps, which are casting from the sun, are essentially doing that same render, but from the sun's perspective. And people don't think about what the sun is seeing. They only think about what's on their screen right now. So just be aware that you can also do a debug of virtual shadow map overdraw, which is another optimization method that really can save quite a lot of perf. The other big call out for handling Nanite correctly that I have is just quite simply, if you've got world position or masking or anything like that, you often want to know that those meshes are being activated and which ones are potentially troublesome. Just be aware that we have a little view mode that you can enable called Pixel Programmable, which just says, hey, these meshes are using masking or they're using displacement or world position offset. No, not displacement. They're using world position offset or masking. And that'll let you know that that's on a separate path and it's a more expensive mesh and maybe something you want to consider. In general, just be aware that there are plenty of overrides for Nanite that you should be looking at. We have them in the materials and on meshes to say, hey, don't allow it on this particular kind of mesh. Useful to know. Now, I want to do a quick little bit of covering of assemblies. If you get a bunch of meshes, you can right-click on them, go down to Level, and you can hit Create Level Instance. This is a really useful workflow that we've been aggressively using at Epic. What it essentially does is it turns that little collection of assets into a level that you can then drop repeatedly, like a little assembly that you can then drop repeatedly inside of your world. That's really, really useful, and you can reopen it at any point by hitting Control-E, modify whatever you need to. When you save, it'll reproduce it in all of the other meshes, okay? Now, I bring this up because a lot of people still use blueprints for these kind of assemblies, but this does allow you to kind of modify it like it's part of the scene, which is really, really powerful. The reason this is also really powerful is that if you're using data layers within those assemblies, it allows you to do things like in this world, I've actually got the ability, once my GIF plays, there we go. So down here, I have created a data layer that says artificial stuff, and whenever I turn that on or off, it'll actually turn on or off all of the things on that particular instance of the level. Essentially, it allows you to create little buttons that say, hey, on this assembly, turn off all the trees or keep them on. But still reproducing the same asset gives you little switches. You can be like, turn all the lights on, turn all the lights off, add all of the artificial stuff, add destruction, whatever it is that you want it to have inside of a data layer. The other thing is on the procedural content side of things, we have full support for it as well, which means that you can actually feed those data instances into our procedural systems, sample them, and reproduce them, which I'll be covering in tomorrow's technical art workshop that I never cease plugging. Thank you for coming. The other one I want to catch up with on this front is that anytime you do have those level instances, which, again, we find a really useful workflow, you can get them and break them back into their base actors to rework with them as if they were never a level instance. So if you have like an ideal setup of a door, bad example, but go with it, I can grab that with all of its meshes and break it and change it for that particular instance on how I need it to look, which allows me to kind of use it as a starting point for assets. If you're going through this and you're making assemblies, my strong recommendation for general workflow is just creating a level instance zoo that is literally a level with all of your other levels in it, which gives you a nice way to kind of quickly jump through them. Now, I mentioned procedural content moments ago. This is a new system that came in with 5.2, so it's about a year or so old. This is Epic's new solution for handling, like, auto-generation of a lot of content, but using artist-driven controls. I really want to stress a few things. The first of those is PCG can read straight off of any landscape that you've got in the world, which means as I paint down data that says rock, it will then generate rocks and things within my world. I can do the same thing and have grime or civilization or whatever other data set I necessarily want to have in there, but the capacity to sample that from the landscape gives you a really good starting point and hopefully gives you an idea of how to use PCG a bit better. Again, we will be covering that in the Tech Art workshop. One of the features of PCG that folks haven't been paying attention to that I think they should, though, is hierarchical generation. So when we say, hey, we can procedurally generate stuff in the world, we don't just mean generating stuff in the world right in front of us. Across the entire world. We can only do the generation when things get close to us. And as they get close to us, we can be generating little blades of grass and rocks and shrubs and things like that, which allows you to have a really dense world without the memory overhead. Be aware that if you're rolling with PCG, I strongly recommend looking at the irregular surface node, which allows you to say, hey, only put things where they fit on the ground and nothing's ever going to be sticking up. I bring this up because it's a subgraph and a lot of people miss it, and I kind of wanted to do a call out. On the topic of PCG as well, the other thing I wanted to kind of cover here is the incoming biome plugin that the first version of that is in 5.4. This allows you to set up multiple procedural content generation systems and merge them together. So I can set up a procedural forest and a procedural beach, and then blend my forest into my beach, which is something that we're really keen on. For custom tooling, a couple of callouts that I want to make. Be aware of geometry script, which allows you to run any of the modeling operations that we have as blueprint script. Okay? In this case, I went ahead and I created a vent asset, and wherever I put the vent asset, it automatically runs the modeling logic and carves a hole in the object behind it, so I don't need to create 50 different versions of that thing to handle wherever I'm putting that hole at that point. So it's really useful stuff. And I did the same stuff when I used the new scriptable tools framework, which allows you to grab anywhere the user is currently clicking. This is a plugin that's off by default, but it allows you to find out where people are clicking and dragging to generate your own tools. In this case, I took an hour and I created a vine painter that would automatically grow vines throughout my world. Okay? On that front, I want to just quickly bring up custom validation. This is something that I think is really important for tooling, but again, it's off by default, so for all game devs out there, I strongly recommend checking this out. This is a plugin on Unreal that allows you to set up hooks so that whenever you're saving something or committing something, it'll run a quick script and check if that was okay. Does the file have broken references? Do the static meshes have materials assigned? Does this blueprint have something referencing it, et cetera, et cetera? You know? So for your specific project, if there are things you never want to happen and that one guy on the team keeps breaking it, it's a good idea to consider setting up custom validation to get past that. In terms of things with bells and whistles, there's a couple of callouts I wanted to make. The first of those is the volume fog domain. So if you get a static mesh, so in this case, I just threw a generic boring sphere into the world, and then you apply any material that has the volume domain on it, it will actually run a voxelization of that material to generate what the fog would look like, which in this case allows me to kind of create custom fog that I can kind of have animated and do whatever I need to. This is really, really powerful in creating like a really interesting environment, and it's very easy to do. Again, it's literally just drop in the mesh and drop on a volume fog material, and you can see that we get a pretty good result that you can access the distance fields and things to like have adhering to surfaces and all sorts of cool stuff. People don't use it. This was going to be a graph for you to look at, but it's a little blurry. But you can check this up online or ping me after the session. I'm happy to forward it to you. Another thing that's on that side of things that folks miss out on is that we have the ability for materials to process how they handle incoming decals, which allows you to get a surface and say, hey, when paint is applied to me, this is how I want to deal with that paint. Really, really useful. It's just essentially overriding your debuffer texture node. And the weird quirk of it is you need to have received decals off. Again, I did have material here, but it's a bit tricky to read, and I'm running short on time. So the other one that I wanted to call out on the bells and whistles side of things here is leveraging translucency overlay. So you can get any mesh in Unreal and do a translucency pass. The cool thing with the translucency pass is it allows you to derive lighting data because you can access the base color of the scene and the final color of the scene. When you divide the two of those things, you can kind of get pretty close to the shadows. This allows me to kind of create, notice I've got that kind of like painterly effect on the edges of the shadows there that's kind of like, looks like it's brush stroked in. Pretty easy to do, but it's through something you may not be looking for it. I had a recent video from GDC that I posted in which we cover this in more detail. On that front, another thing that came in reasonably recently is the post-process material chain plugin. A little tricky to see here, but you can get any of your images that you're rendering, and you can output them to a render target. And when you output them to a render target, you can then get that same image and run additional operations on it. So what does that mean? That means that I can run like edge detection, which is very easy, right? Like standard Sobel edge detection, we can get a quick outline. But then what I can do is I can feed the output of the outlines to a post-process that blurs them. And instead of me having to run the outline shader multiple times to get those blur steps, which is expensive, I can kind of kick that off to here and then create like a much more interesting, artistically driven, I swear it's normally much prettier than that, type of scene for you to check out. Cool thing as well that I want to point out when it comes to like stylizing games that I've been using a little bit recently with certain projects is in Unreal we have a little node called the instance fade node, which tells the engine this object is about to fade out. If you don't have fading enabled, you can actually plug it into your world position offset, which allows you to shrink and bounce those objects in instead of fading them, which I think is a really cute look, and it's like 6 nodes. Really, really easy to pay off and easy to set up. I'm not sure if we have sound running through the engine, but I will flag the Soundscape plugin. If we have audio, it'll kick in just a second. We don't have audio. All right, so essentially what happens is we have a plugin that you can enable called Soundscape. Soundscape allows you to say, hey, in these types of biomes, procedurally spawn audio around me that's tracing downwards, finding the nearest surface, those kinds of things. So I can start to say, hey, start bringing in rivers, start bringing in streams, start bringing in whatever you need to. Really useful and saves you a lot of time. As far as bells and whistles go, the last 2 things that I want to cover, first of those is just Niagara simulations. Be aware that if you have a Niagara system in your project, you can have it drive all of your procedural local wind and feed all of your effects into it to access it. We should have a talk coming on that online for documentation pretty soon from Xiao Yue on the Chinese team. But essentially, this is a really useful technique, and it's a good thing to think about because it's essentially using Unreal's visual effects system that we commonly associate with particles, but instead accessing physics data in the world and outputting it to textures so that all of our assets in the world can kind of bend and do all sorts of other things inside of the materials instead. It's a really good approach. As far as Niagara is concerned, the only other thing I really wanted to call out was Niagara caching, which is a feature that came in a little while ago. Be aware that any ridiculously heavy particle sim that you have, you can actually run and cache and save it. And the reason I bring that up is because if you are doing any animation work inside of UE, or you have cutscenes or anything like that, knowing that your particle system is going to play back exactly as you intended every time is really, really important. You're either incredibly impressed or very tired. Now, what that means is that having that system in there allows you to have consistency between each of your things. As far as that's concerned, the last thing I just really want to touch on in the last couple of minutes of the talk, my apologies, is just some general useful shortcuts that I really like to use inside of it. First off, just be aware that everyone clicks on the arrows to move objects around. If you click on the ball in the middle of it, it actually moves it in screen space, which is really useful for just like nudging it to the left, but not necessarily tied to a coordinate system. Another shortcut that I use a lot is Control-E. If you hit Control-E on any object, it'll open the editor for that object. Particle system opens the particle editor, mesh opens the mesh editor, landscape opens the materials, et cetera, et cetera. Control-B, similarly, if you click on any object, will find that in the content browser. Really useful little shortcut. Another one that I use aggressively is Shift-E will select all matching meshes of whatever you've got currently selected. And that's a really great way of me going, click, Shift-E, hide all of that. Click, Shift-E, hide all of that. I know that sounds like a weird workflow thing, but I use it aggressively. If you're switching between orthographic viewports and you want to do it without going through the menus, Control middle mouse and dragging it, which is not a very discoverable thing, allows you to quickly switch between top-down orthographic, left orthographic, back orthographic, and perspective. Perspective being down and to the left. Another one that I want to flag is just Control-tilde as far as the shortcuts are concerned. This is something I use a lot, which switches between world space alignment and local space alignment. So if you're trying to move something along its current anchoring, that helps out a lot. In addition to that, another thing I use a lot in trying to get alignment correct is Alt-middle mouse. If you click Alt-middle mouse, it'll create a temporary pivot point at that location, allowing you to rotate it. So if you make it look like someone kicked the couch, and you're not rotating from the middle of the couch, you're rotating from over here. You can all see my imaginary couch. That allows you to kind of like set that up, which is really useful. If you're ever that person that's dragging and then moving the camera, then dragging and moving the camera, stop being that person. Holding Shift when you drag locks the camera in place and keeps it with you as you drag the object around, okay? Cool kids are doing it. You should do it too. Pressing End drops any mesh down to the ground at any point. This is really useful as it'll just get the object and quickly place it. If you're still leaving things slightly floating above the ground when you're making things, I want you to know I will judge you. Similarly, you can actually use Unreal's physics system to do a similar thing. If you have physics enabled and you hit Simulate or Play, when you're kind of cool with where everything is, click on it and hit K. K is for keep. And when you press that, it will save their locations even after you close play, and it will now bake them into that location. Other thing I want to flag here is just bookmarks. Hitting Control-1, Control-2, Control-3, Control-4, those kind of things, saves the location of where you are at that moment and allows you, whenever you press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., to teleport back to that location at any point. Pro tip, the first thing I do whenever I open someone's new project to help out on the DevRel stuff is I go through those numbers, and I can actually see what was important to the artist because I can see what they bookmarked within it. The last thing I want to flag is quite simply, we've added a console variable tool. I've brought up a lot of console variables throughout this presentation, and I was kind of like smashing through because of time. But this actually lets you open up and browse all of the options. You can see all of the console variables, and you can actually see what the default value was and what's currently overriding it, as well as being able to save presets. So I can save a preset that's good for debugging. I can save a good preset that might be useful for AI stuff. Another preset that might be good for focusing on certain art problems or refinements, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that was a lot of content to cover in 30 minutes. It's because I over-prepared, but I hope this has been useful, and I'm keen to chat to the rest of you throughout DevGAMM. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.